Well, hello there, Jason D'Souza coming to you from a very brisk Tokyo, and some really interesting feedback on something I posted recently on my page about the change in GDP numbers between countries. So in 1995, the US was around 24% of nominal GDP of the world. Japan closely followed at 17%, and then you had sort of a cavalcade of European countries, Germany, France and the UK, sort of in the top five. Fast forward to 2025, and of course the world is a very different place. The US has retained its nominal GDP lead, somewhere in the region of 27%. China, after 30 years of growth at 10% or more, is now sort of almost pushing 17%. But Japan has sort of fallen way behind, under 4% of GDP, nominal GDP. And Europe, India has come up to fourth place in around 4% and growing fast. And you see Europe really fall behind sort of Germany, France and the UK, sort of under 4%. In fact, the European story is not a positive one over the last period of time, where they were somewhere rivaling the United States in terms of their economic size in the 90s, 95, 6. Now they're sort of less, far less, under 20%. And you really have to ask in Europe what the profit of the European Union system has been, when you're in a situation where such a large amount of over-regulation and sort of complicated governance appears to have really held back European progress. My European friends, including my great friend Olli Mustonen, will disagree with me on some of these points. But as a partial European myself, I look at Europe and I wonder, what the pathway forward is for some of these countries. But nonetheless, let's talk about Japan. So the Japanese of my youth was a period of time where everything was made in Japan, and you were buying everything from Japan. That has changed materially now. It is now China that's sort of the manufacturing center of the world, and that's being driven and that's been shown up in its numbers. I think now you see India coming up now after the market liberalization that China went through in the 70s and 80s. India started to go through that in the sort of 2010s, starting with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, and that now is starting to come through the system. Prime Minister Modi now trying very hard to focus on made in India, trying very hard to generate an Indian economy that will sort of replicate the sort of Chinese growth levels and bring millions out of poverty in India. Japan's an interesting story in the sense that it's now, having run from the 90s, after the 90s asset bubble, with a long period of deflation and a long period of stagnation that we all learnt about at school, I guess, is now starting to refocus its things. So I look back now and being here, things that you used to imagine were made in Japan are no longer Japanese owned. So like televisions, Sharp, Toshiba, those sorts of things now largely owned by other companies. So those export-focused products, consumer products that you would have imagined out of Japan sort of 10, 15 years ago are now all being made in China. Where Japan is really excelling now is on the high-tech equipment, high-tech energy products. Capital flows in particular have become very important out of Japan, and international investments. You see big companies, Mitsubishi, Mitsui, investing into the United States' energy markets. Mitsubishi just did a big gas deal in the US. Of course, in our own country, in Australia, you see many Japanese companies getting involved in the resources and energy markets increasingly. And I think that can only be a sort of positive thing for Japan as it seeks to find growth in markets outside of its own. Interestingly enough, Japan's also really focusing on a domestic economy, domestic consumption, getting its population to spend more in its own country, which I think is also a pathway, an interesting pathway, I think, here. So what does this all mean then in terms of the change in GDP contributions to the world in terms of geopolitics? Well, I think it's been an interesting few weeks. You've got President Trump talking about Greenland, European nations worried about that. Japan here itself is worried about a depreciating yen. The BOJ, which I'm actually just in front of here, has been talking about whether it should come in to support the yen. there's a whole bunch of stuff going on. But I think one of the key things to think about here is the fact that with the rise of China and the US increasingly looking to itself and looking at an America First strategy, the whole concept of partnerships between nations has started to change. So, I've talked a lot about groupings on our channel about the Quad being an example of that. India, the United States, Japan, and Australia coming together as like-minded countries to explore technology partnerships, to explore economic partnerships, whereas the broader multilateral examples of trade, whether it be the WTO or others, increasingly seem to become irrelevant. And interestingly enough, Davos is going on at the moment, and no one seems to really care too much about that either right now in terms of what's being said there. So I see more of these partnerships like the Quad really coming into play in the next sort of years ahead as well. AUKUS, again, it started as a defense partnership. Increasingly, we're starting to see more of a discussion about technology come into play there. And again, I think that's going to be very important going forward for us. So the third point I want to make here as well is the importance of commercial partnerships is becoming highlighted even more so than before. There have always been joint ventures between companies that have made things, but I think what's changed now in this geopolitical environment is that like-minded companies from like-minded countries can achieve a lot together in international markets. And in fact, that's what I spend a lot of my time at Idea Partners doing, is really helping companies join together and work together in achieving great things. And so, we are increasingly seeing international capital coming to Australia as sort of a safe place to invest, where you can achieve returns, where you've got a strong regulatory system, where you've got very stable governance at a state and federal level, where you have an enormous investment still in infrastructure, enormous investments across the board by governments that are attractive to international companies, and where the opportunity of partnership between Australian companies and other companies, be it from Japan, where we work a lot with Japanese companies, or other countries, is becoming more and more important. So there are some thoughts. I just thought the response to that post I put up about the change in GDP numbers and contributions of countries between nominal GDP, that is, between 1995 and 2025 was really interesting. People found that pretty interesting, so I thought I'd make some comments on that. I hope you're all well, and I'll see you on the next one.